No, you're not as in control as you think. From those little habits that repeat almost without you noticing to the decisions that seem to shape your life, every action, every choice is guided, not by you, but by the consequences around you, like invisible strings pulling your movements. For psychologist B.F. Skinner, one of the key figures in behavioral psychology, our actions, thoughts, and even emotions are manipulated, as if we're obedient actors on a stage of rewards and punishments. Whether you realize it or not, your life exists within an endless cycle of rewards and corrections, a hidden choreography that dictates your every step, where what we call free will might just be a clever illusion. To understand the essence of Skinner's thinking, we need to start with the core of his theory, behavioral selection. Just as Darwin proposed that physical traits in living beings evolve through natural selection, Skinner suggested that our behaviors develop and stick around based on a type of selection. But here, it's selection by consequences. Imagine each action we take as a kind of experiment. What works? What brings us some form of reward? Tends to repeat. Meanwhile, what fails, what doesn't result in a satisfying consequence, gradually fades from our repertoire. Skinner believed that human behavior, just like that of any living creature, is shaped by the consequences it experiences in its environment. Think of a simple daily habit, like checking your phone as soon as you wake up. If, in doing so, you find something interesting or relevant, you're likely to repeat this behavior day after day without even noticing. This repetition isn't driven by a conscious desire, but because positive reinforcement, the reward of finding something interesting, has created an invisible mark. Encouraging this action, according to Skinner, our lives are formed by a nearly endless sequence of these patterns, and understanding how they work is the first step to seeing what truly drives our actions. To make behavioral selection easier to understand, Skinner used a powerful analogy, Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin observed that species in nature adapt their traits to increase their chances of survival and reproduction. A classic example is the beaks of birds, which vary based on their environment and available food. Birds that eat hard seeds, for instance, developed stronger and sturdier beaks over generations. This adjustment is like a slow dance between the organism and its environment, with each change selected because it provides a specific advantage. But what if we apply this concept of adjustments and adaptations to behavior? Skinner believed that our behavior is molded in a similar way, but much faster and on an individual level. Rather than waiting generations to see a change, each of us constantly adapts to the consequences we experience in our environment. It's as if, throughout our lives, we're in a quiet lab where each behavior is tested and retested, with results that lead us to adjust our actions, repeating what works and abandoning what doesn't serve us. Think, for example, about how we learn to interact in a new work environment. In those first few days, we observe how colleagues react to different ways of communicating, and adjust our behavior based on that feedback. If we notice a colleague responds better when we speak casually, we're likely to adapt our tone in future interactions. If another colleague is more efficient and straightforward, we learn to be more direct with them. These adjustments become a sort of personal, behavioral evolution, an adaptation that helps us better navigate different life contexts. This kind of behavioral selection is so ingrained that we might not even notice it, but it's easy to see if we pay attention. Since childhood, we learn what works and what doesn't. For instance, a child who receives a smile and praise for sharing a toy with a friend learns that this behavior is valued and tends to repeat it. Meanwhile, a behavior followed by reprimand is more likely to be set aside, just like in nature, where traits stick around because they aid survival. Our behaviors are shaped by the rewards and punishments we receive. This process guides us almost like a river flowing around obstacles and barriers, always moving toward the positive reinforcements it encounters. Skinner saw a direct parallel between this behavioral selection and the natural world, and this comparison helps us see behavior as something shaped and adaptable, rather than something rigid or unchangeable. He believed our actions are responses to context, responses we can observe and even predict if we understand what drives each choice. In short, Skinner's theory leads us to think that our behavior, for the most part, doesn't come out of nowhere and isn't entirely free. Instead, it's the result of an ongoing process of adjustments, a set of responses adapted to the consequences we experience. When talking about how behavior is shaped, the term conditioning often comes up. This divides into two main types: classical conditioning, developed by Pavlov, and operant conditioning. Skinner's essential contribution to behaviorism. Let's understand the difference between them. In classical conditioning, behavior is influenced by the association of stimuli. Imagine you're watching a movie and suddenly, intense music starts playing. Your heart races, and you already know something scary is about to happen. In this case, your body responded to the music stimulus, associating it with the suspenseful scene that's about to follow. Almost like an automatic reflex, Pavlov demonstrated this with an experiment involving dogs, showing that they would start salivating just from hearing a bell, associating the sound with the food that followed. This type of response is natural and unconscious. We're conditioned to react to stimuli automatically. But Skinner went further and proposed operant conditioning, which is a bit different. In operant conditioning, behavior is shaped by consequences, and this implies a choice, even if indirectly. Imagine you receive a reward for completing a task at work, praise from your boss, for example, or a financial bonus. This positive reinforcement increases the likelihood that you'll repeat the same action in the future, as your brain recognizes that this specific action brought an advantage. The opposite also occurs. If you receive a warning for doing something improperly, you're less likely to repeat that action. So, in operant conditioning, we're not simply reacting to stimuli. We're, at some level, learning to make choices that bring rewards or avoid punishments. For Skinner, operant conditioning was essential because it allowed us to understand how complex behaviors are formed and maintained over time. He saw reinforcement, the positive effect of an action, as the cornerstone in building habits and behaviors. Unlike classical conditioning, which is more reactive and automatic, operant conditioning allows for a form of active learning where our actions are sculpted according to the consequences we experience. This type of conditioning is so present in our lives that we often barely notice it from a young age. We're reinforced to act in certain ways, whether to gain approval, avoid punishment, or achieve some kind of satisfaction. In short, while classical conditioning explains our automatic, associative responses, operant conditioning, according to Skinner, reveals a more intentional and adaptive process, where behavior is guided by consequences. This was Skinner's legacy to the study of behavior. The idea that, rather than merely reacting to the world, we also learn to act upon it in pursuit of results. One of Skinner's most curious experiments is the superstition in pigeons experiment, which shows how even seemingly irrational behaviors can arise from random reinforcements. The idea was simple. Skinner placed pigeons in a box where, at set intervals, a device would release a small amount of food. But here's the detail. The food didn't depend on any action from the pigeons. It was released automatically without requiring the pigeons to do anything specific to receive it. However, something interesting happened. Even though the food appeared randomly, the pigeons began repeating specific movements as if they believed these actions were responsible for the reward. One pigeon, for example, might spin in circles, while another moved its head to one side, as if these gestures were rituals that attracted the food. It was as if they were developing superstitions. Believing these behaviors increased their chances of getting food. This experiment reveals something intriguing about behavior, not just in pigeons, but also in us. As humans, how many times have you heard someone say they wear a lucky shirt to watch their favorite team's game, or avoid stepping on cracks on the sidewalk out of superstition? In reality, these behaviors follow the same logic. If an action seems to coincide with a positive outcome, the brain may link them and reinforce the repetition of that behavior, even if there's no real connection between them. Skinner's idea here is that superstitious behavior arises from the need to find patterns and feel some control over our environment, a way to comfort ourselves in the face of uncertainty. For Skinner, this experiment demonstrated that superstitious behavior wasn't exclusive to humans. It's a reflection of how all beings, to varying degrees, seek patterns to explain and make sense of what happens around them. The superstition in pigeons shows that, even without a real causal relationship, we're easily led to believe that our actions influence the world, even if it's just an illusion. According to Skinner, This type of behavior is a byproduct of the same reinforcement mechanisms that shape our more rational and adaptive behaviors. For Skinner, human behavior isn't something rigid and predictable. Rather, it's probabilistic. This means it operates based on the likelihood that certain actions will repeat or disappear depending on the consequences they produce. This concept is key to understanding Skinner's behaviorism, as he believed that while reinforcement increases the chance a behavior will occur again, it never fully guarantees it. Consider, for example, the act of studying for a test. Suppose someone studies intensely for an exam and receives a good grade. This positive result increases the probability that they'll adopt the same study approach for future exams because they've seen that the effort was rewarded. However, if they study just as hard the next time but receive a low grade, this same practice might not have the same reinforcing effect. The behavior of studying then becomes less predictable and depends on various conditions that can alter the expected outcome. Skinner argued that this variability was essential to understanding human behavior. Especially in more complex contexts, unlike a machine that always responds the same way, we respond based on the probabilities we've learned to associate with each situation. This probabilistic approach is also what makes human behavior so adaptable. Each of us has a history of reinforcements and punishments, and our future actions depend on this accumulated history, which can be adjusted at any moment based on the new consequences we experience. This probabilistic view helps us better understand why certain habits and behaviors emerge or disappear in different contexts. For example, someone might develop the habit of going to the gym because, over time, they were reinforced with benefits like increased energy, better health, and compliments from friends. However, if these rewards lessen or become less relevant, the behavior might not be repeated as frequently. The essence of Skinner's theory is that our actions aren't certainties, but chances, a dance between what we expect and what actually happens. At its core, the concept of probability in behavior shows that we are flexible, not because we control every action, but because our behavior is constantly adjusted by the consequences we experience. This perspective highlights that our actions are always the product of a set of possibilities and contexts, where reinforcement doesn't guarantee an action, but instead tips the scale in favor of its repetition. In the field of psychology, Skinner and cognitive theorists differ deeply in how they view human behavior. While Skinner argued that behavior is almost entirely shaped by external reinforcements and punishments, cognitive theorists claim that internal processes, like thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions, play a crucial role in our actions. For Skinner, the mind was a black box, difficult to study objectively. He believed that instead of focusing on internal processes, psychology should concentrate on what is observable, actions and the consequences of those actions. For cognitive theorists, understanding behavior without considering mental processes would be an incomplete view of reality. They argue that thoughts, memories, and perceptions shape how we interpret and react to the world around us. Imagine, for instance, two people facing the same challenge. For one, it represents an exciting opportunity, while for the other, it causes anxiety and fear. Cognitive theorists would say these different reactions stem from distinct mental processes, and it's essential to understand these processes to explain variations in behavior. Skinner, on the other hand, would view this situation differently. He would argue that each response is the result of a unique history of reinforcements and punishments that, over time, shaped each individual's way of responding to challenges. For Skinner, examining subjective thoughts or beliefs would add unnecessary layers to the study of behavior, distancing psychology from objective science. In his view, behavior is governed by probabilities and is a response to experience consequences, not necessarily an expression of internal thoughts or intentions. This contrast between Skinner and cognitive theorists sparked a crucial debate in psychology. With each perspective bringing unique contributions, cognitive theorists highlighted the importance of mental processes, while Skinner emphasized the relevance of consequences and the environment. Despite their disagreements, the dialogue between these two schools of thought enriched our understanding of human behavior, showing that it is, in fact, the result of a complex interaction between what goes on within us and what happens around us. While Skinner focused on the consequences and external reinforcements that shape our behavior, advances in neuroscience have brought a new layer of understanding, regarding how actions are stored and modified in the brain. Neuroplasticity. This concept refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself, creating and strengthening neural connections in response to the experiences we go through. In other words, it's not just the environment that influences us. Our brain also adjusts and adapts, recording our experiences and forming maps of behavior over time. Imagine you're learning to play an instrument. At first, it takes a lot of concentration to coordinate your movements, but with practice, repetition makes this activity more automatic. This happens because the neural connections associated with these movements strengthen, as if your brain is memorizing each chord and note. This adaptive capacity is neuroplasticity in action. Reinforcements and rewards can speed up this process, as our brain responds more readily when it recognizes that certain actions bring benefits. This plasticity of the brain complements Skinner's view by helping us understand how behavior becomes more automated and resilient over time. Each behavior repeated with positive reinforcement is more than just a simple response to the environment. It creates a neural mark, a kind of trail that becomes easier and easier to follow. And these trails, once formed, tend to persist, influencing our future choices and reactions, even when external reinforcements are no longer present. Neuroplasticity, therefore, allows conditioned behavior to be stored in the brain in a physical form, showing how our memories and habits are literally sculpted into our brain structure. By combining the concept of neuroplasticity with Skinner's behavioral selection, we realize that beyond the environment and consequences, there is a powerful internal component that shapes our actions. This understanding makes human behavior even more complex, showing that it is the result of both responses to the environment and adaptations and memories embedded in our brains. Today, it's easy to see how Skinner's theory applies to the digital environment. Especially on social media, we live in a world where each like, share, and comment serves as reinforcement that shapes our actions and even our thoughts. It's as if we're constantly in a digital lab, where each interaction receives feedback that influences our next moves. Social media uses these reinforcements almost invisibly, making our behaviors guided by algorithms that reinforce what captures our attention. Think, for example, about how you feel when you receive notifications of likes and comments on a photo you posted. These small reinforcements create a feeling of reward, motivating you to keep posting, interacting, and, without realizing it, fueling the cycle. Algorithms are designed to show content you're likely to enjoy, increasing the probability that you'll stay engaged on the platform. And so, our behavior is shaped to satisfy what the algorithm wants. We end up consuming certain content, liking specific posts, and even expressing opinions that we know will gain more approval. Skinner would likely say that social media has turned us into slaves of the algorithm, where each like or comment notification functions as reinforcement that directs our actions. But unlike Skinner's controlled experiments, where reinforcement was planned, social media creates an environment in which reinforcement is automated and personalized, increasing its influence over our behavior. This effect is so intense that it often shapes our self-image and influences our choices and beliefs, pushing us to act in line with digital world norms. Thus, Skinner's theory of behavioral selection by reinforcement is more relevant than ever. In digital environments, we're encouraged to behave in ways that keep us connected and engaged, making our actions increasingly predictable and directed by the algorithm. In this context, free will seems even more elusive, showing that, just like in Skinner's experiments, our choices may not be as free as we'd like to imagine. Every decision we make, from the simplest habits to the big choices in life, is influenced by subtle forces that reinforce our behaviors without us even noticing. Skinner showed us that our actions aren't as free as they seem. They follow a logic of reinforcements and consequences, almost like an invisible choreography, shaped by experiences, interactions, and even algorithms. But what if we start paying attention to these patterns? Observing what motivates each action gives us a new way to understand who we really are and what we want to reinforce in our own lives. This awareness is the first step toward conscious freedom, a choice about what we'll allow to influence us. Because in the end, as Skinner showed, perhaps freedom is, above all, the awareness of what controls us.